Imagine living in a world where playing the wrong musical instrument could get your door broken down. Not because you were playing badly, not because the neighbours had finally lost patience, but because the instrument itself belonged, in some strange legal sense, to someone else. Now, imagine the instrument is a trumpet, and imagine that the men who claim the right to play it are not gentle souls with polished mouthpieces and tasteful concert attire, but a privileged brotherhood of military trumpeters who believe that your little practice session is an attack upon their ancient rights. According to Hermann Eichborn, something very like this happened in Hanover toward the end of the 17th century. A group of the elector's trumpeters were in dispute with a town musician. This town musician had apparently been practicing the trumpet. The trumpeters broke into his house, confiscated the instrument, and, in Eichborn's wonderfully alarming account, struck out several of his front teeth with it. They then claimed that they had merely been exercising their rights. This is the Musical Archeologist, Forgotten Ideas from Music's Past. I'm Craig Dabelstein, and today's forgotten idea is that for much of history, musical instruments were not always just musical instruments. Sometimes they were privileges, sometimes they were badges of rank, sometimes they were tools of civic order, military authority, and social exclusion. And sometimes, apparently, they could be used as dental instruments of a rather brutal kind. The source for this episode is Hermann Eichborn's On the History of Instrumental Music, originally published in German in 1885. Eichborn was a lawyer, scholar, and musical critic, and that combination matters. He did not look at music merely as sound. He looked at it as something embedded in law, custom, professional rights, public institutions, and social class. And when he writes about trumpeters, he is not simply interested in how the trumpet sounded. He is interested in who was allowed to sound it. That is an important distinction. Today we tend to think of instruments as available things. If you can buy a trumpet, you can learn the trumpet. If you can find a teacher or a method book or a YouTube video, then the instrument is yours to attempt. You may torment the household, distress the dog, and rearrange the emotional life of your family. But legally speaking, the trumpet is not forbidden territory. But in earlier European society, certain instruments carried a public meaning that went far beyond music, and the trumpet was one of them. It was associated with courts, armies, ceremony, command, rank, heraldry, and power. Trumpets announced princes. They accompanied soldiers. Trumpets belonged to public splendour and military order. They did not merely make notes. They proclaimed authority. Eichborn is especially interested in what he calls the field trumpeters and military kettle drummers. These men, he insists, were not simply ordinary musicians organised in an ordinary guild. They were connected to princes and lords. They stood close to military and aristocratic life. Their profession was treated not as a common trade, but as something like a free knightly art. Not just a job, not just a skill, not merely the ability to produce a clear high note after sufficient practice and suffering, but an art surrounded by honour, rank, privilege, and exclusion. Over time, these trumpeters formed a privileged fellowship with special rights. Their purpose was partly military and partly artistic, but their privilege was also defensive. They claimed the right to exclude others from their occupation. In plain language, they believed that not everyone should be allowed to use the trumpet professionally. This is where things become both fascinating and slightly ridiculous. Eichborn describes a world in which trumpeters were highly sensitive to unauthorised trumpet blowing. Tower musicians, town players, tavern fiddlers, and other practical working musicians could find themselves in conflict with these privileged professionals. The field trumpeters guarded their symbolic territory with remarkable jealousy. Even certain related instruments could become suspect. Eichborn notes that mandates in electoral Saxony tried to prevent people from evading trumpet privileges by playing French horns or trombones in trumpet fashion, or by using so-called invention trumpets. Think about that for a moment. It was not only the trumpet that mattered, it was the trumpet-like act, the style of blowing, the public signal, the sound of command. The question was not merely, what instrument are you holding? The question was, are you trespassing upon our sound? That's why the Hanover story is so memorable. It compresses the whole strange system into one violent little episode. A town musician practices the trumpet. The privileged trumpeters object. They enter his home, seize the instrument, and allegedly knock out his teeth. Then they defend themselves by claiming that they were enforcing their rights. There is almost a dark comedy in it. The trumpet, an instrument of ceremony and splendour, becomes an instrument of professional discipline. The guardians of noble musical privilege behave rather less nobly than one might hope. Yet, beneath the absurdity lies something serious. Eichborn is showing us that musical life was never separate from social life. Who could perform, where they could perform, what they could play, and what instruments they could use, all of this belonged to a larger world of rights, ranks, offices, and permissions. To us, the idea of a trumpet monopoly may seem absurd, but every society has its own protected sounds. Think of the school bell, the military bugle, the police siren, the church bell, the national anthem, the call to prayer, the judge's gavel, the emergency alarm. These are not just noises, they are authorised sounds. They do something in public. They summon, command, warn, sanctify, organise, or identify. The trumpet, in Eichborn's world, belonged partly to that category. It was not simply an instrument for entertainment, it was a voice of authority, and that authority had professional guardians. Of course, there is another side to this. Professional privilege can protect standards. It can ensure training, it can preserve difficult skills, it can defend musicians from being undercut by amateurs or opportunists. Eichborn himself, later in the book, argues strongly that musicians need order, dignity, and professional rights. So we should not reduce this to a simple story of bad old guilds and modern freedom. The question is more complicated. When does professional protection preserve an art? And when does it become bullying? When does a tradition defend excellence? And when does it merely defend territory? The field trumpeters may have preserved a remarkable tradition. The old art of high trumpet playing, especially the clarino style used in Baroque music, required extraordinary discipline, breath control, embouchure, and training. Eichborn admired that art deeply. He did not think trumpet playing was easy, crude, or merely loud. At its best, he thought it was refined, brilliant, heroic, and almost irreplaceable. But he also saw the absurdity of privilege when it hardened into arrogance. The trumpeters of Hanover were not defending Bach, they were defending turf. And perhaps that is what makes the story so useful. It reminds us that music history is not only the history of beautiful works, great composers, and noble ideals. It's also the history of jobs, jealousies, permissions, monopolies, anxieties, and professional survival. Behind the sound of an old trumpet call, there may be a whole social world. Princes, soldiers, city councils, guilds, apprentices, tower musicians, tavern players, court officials, and men willing to fight, quite literally, over who had the right to blow. For modern musicians, there is something oddly familiar here. We may no longer have trumpet police. No one, I hope, is going to break into your house because you've attempted the Haydn trumpet concerto before breakfast. But we still live with questions of legitimacy. Who is allowed to call themselves a musician? Who has the right to teach? Who gets paid? Who gets protected? Who is excluded? Who is dismissed as an amateur, an outsider, a freelancer, a hobbyist, a mere entertainer? And who gets to decide? Eichborn's trumpet story survives because it is absurd, but it matters because it is not only absurd. It is a miniature portrait of music as a profession trying to define itself. A profession that wants dignity, that wants standards, and that wants protection. And sometimes a profession that mistakes protection for possession. So the next time we hear a trumpet, whether in a symphony, a military ceremony, a brass band, or a solemn call from somewhere in the distance, perhaps we might hear more than the note itself. We might hear an old argument. Who owns this sound? Who may speak with this voice? And what happens when music, which seems so free as it rings through the air, is claimed by law, rank, and power? Because in Eichborn's forgotten world, The trumpet was not merely blown, it was authorised. And woe betide the poor town musician who forgot that. You've been listening to The Musical Archeologist, forgotten ideas from music's past. Written and presented by me, Craig Dabelstein. The music for this podcast was composed by Jeffrey Young. The Musical Archeologist is one of many projects from Maxime's Music, dedicated to recovering forgotten music, forgotten writings, and forgotten musical worlds. Thank you for listening.